So yesterday we saw the architecture of JCR. The storage area in your AEM is your JCR. Entire data of your website is stored in the form of nodes and properties, right? And we also saw that it's a hierarchical based data model, and every node has associated properties. Now these are key value pairs, and every property also had a data type, like what we saw was string, there was date, there was for numerics there was a number, and all these things we saw, right? That was on my repository. That's the storage model. What is the benefit of JCR over traditional database is we saw those 4 or 5 features like indexing, a built-in search mechanism rather than querying it. Then we also saw something called as an observation, where whenever a property changes you could have a Java class that would get executed, right? We saw those benefits of JCR, and also the user management and permissioning, right? Then we saw that to access this JCR over the web, the Sling acts like a controller, where it's a REST based protocol to access the JCR over the web. Then we also saw OSGi, which is a modular programming approach. Right? These are the 3 layers that we saw yesterday. So going a little further, let's talk about Sling in detail. Sling is a way of webifying the content. Content is in the JCR. Okay. Which means it's basically a REST based protocol to access the JCR over the web. Now, can somebody talk about REST protocol in general? Any idea? What is this REST? Any answers? REST stands for representational. Go ahead. If somebody wants to add something, please go ahead. Okay. So the concepts of REST is basically used to access a resource. Okay. Now, when I say access a resource, right? How do we access it, right? It's a HTTP based protocol. Okay. Every object right here, or every object or a resource, right, is identified by an URL. Okay. What do I mean by a URI? Anybody? Unique resource identifier, which means you cannot have 2 objects having the same URI, right? It needs to be unique. Okay. So every object is identified by a URI. Then you can also have multiple representations of a resource. Okay. When I say multiple representations, whenever you access a resource, generally you would see, for example, let's say I open up cisco.com. And here, this is HTML. This is a HTML representation. Okay. So with REST, not only can you get a HTML representations, right, but also it supports other representations like JSON and XML. Okay. So that's the reason it's called representational state transfer, right? Because you get multiple representations for a given resource. And then it's also a stateless protocol. You have 2 kinds of protocols. One is the stateful and one is the stateless. Can anybody think of what I mean by stateful and stateless? Any idea? In a banking application, is it a stateful protocol or is it a stateless protocol? For example, you're keying in the username and password, right? which means you're actually maintaining a session, and subsequent requests once you key in the password will not prompt you for a username password for every transaction, right? You would have a cookie that would time out, like let's say after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or subsequent requests will know where the previous requests came from because you're tracking the state. But with REST, that's not the case, right? One request will be served by a response, and the next request is a different game altogether, right? So in a subsequent request is, you do not maintain the state across the request, so it's a stateless protocol. One full cycle is one request and one response. Yeah? So that is REST for you. Now what I'm saying is, in terms of Sling, I'm saying Sling is a REST based protocol, which means in terms of JCR, everything is a node, because the node is the unit of storage in JCR, right? So everything is a node. Now I'm using Sling to access these nodes and display on my web, right? Because when I say go to the site admin, now when I try to access this URL, this is actually a node, right? After all, this points to a node location. When I go to this path, a few more points from yesterday. Every node, right, surely has a property called JCR primary type. That's the reason you see a mandatory set to true, which means you cannot have a node without this. And when you create any page in AEM, right, let's say the websites, right, is always pointing to this slash content over here. So any page you create will be below slash content, right? Now when I go to geometrics and when I say new page, right, it's going to create a node below slash content slash geometrics. And let's say I call it a sample. Okay. Now if you see, there's content geometric sample, right? When I created a page, right, I'm going to add this, very important. Whenever I create a page, a node of type CQ colon page gets created, and the child of this node is always going to be a node labeled JCR content. This is the label here, and its JCR primary type would be CQ colon page content. Okay, so this is a very important node. Whenever I create a page, any page created in AEM would be below slash content and the site, okay, whatever site you're creating below. And then the JCR primary type of a page would be CQ colon page, and the child node this is very important, okay, because since your entire Sling resolution is based on how it resolves to this JCR content child node, okay, would be a node labeled JCR content of type CQ colon page content. which means when I try to access this, right, there is a Sling resolution mechanism which is happening that is actually connecting this thing to a view. We still don't know where the view is, right? When I say view, it's usually a HTML or a JSP, right? But we still don't know where the view layer is. Okay, so your Sling is basically connecting the model. Model is my slash content. The entire data is connecting the model to the view. When I say view, it could be your JSP or HTML. Now, the question is, how do we form the URLs in AEM? Okay, there are 3-4 ways here you need to understand. Any URL would be HTTP server name followed by the port number, okay, and then slash. If it is touch UI, it would be editor.html. If it's classic UI, it would be CF hash, followed by the content path. Okay, this is on author instance. Of course, on the publish instance, because it's not editable, you wouldn't even see this editor.html or the CF hash over here. And then the content path dot html. Okay, so some examples. First one, here is the content path. Content Citrix, for example, let's say Citrix is my site name, english.html. This is URL with the content path. So in this URL, what is the content path? Beginning with this root maps to your root node in your repository slash content Citrix. This is your content path. Slash content Citrix. That's the first kind of URL. Does anybody know what is the meaning of a query parameter? Generally, any idea why we need a query parameter? Okay, so query parameters are key value pairs that you have in your URL so that you can pass some data along with the URL. For example, your username, password, all these things. Question mark, let's say name equal to ABC. And if you want to add multiple, see, key and a value. Key is name, value is John, and a value. Okay, and if I want to have a second query parameter, I will use ampersand over here. Then age equal to 25. Okay, the reason that you pass this, all right, is so that you can pick up this data on your server side, right? Obviously, when you want to pick up, for example, you want to query a database for the person called John, right? Because you've added this on your server side, you would have something like, how do you fetch query parameters on the server side? Anybody knows this? In a servlet, for example, let's say I'm coding a servlet. Anybody? Request that get parameter. You guys are still with me, right? Do you have any audio troubles or any issues with the video or anything? Just let me know. Yeah, all of you with me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay.
Rajesh, the second query, are we passing a get parameter, get request there?
By default, any request you make in AEM is a get. unless
Okay.
you exclusively set it as a post.
Okay. Okay.
Not only AEM, any server by default, anything you try to access is a GET request.
Okay.
When do you use post? Anybody remember? Anybody knows? It's a basic HTML concept. When do you use post?
When we want to submit any data to the server, so we use post
Form,
request.
some form, for example, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you would get this name and process it accordingly, and maybe make a JDBC call to your server and get the data for this guy. Right? This is how you fetch it. This is the second kind of URL. The third type is a URL with a selector. What do I mean by a selector? Selectors are used to add additional information to the URL. Right? Now, you might ask me, hey, I'm already passing the information with the help of a query parameter. Why do we need this selector? The advantage with selector is query parameter requests with query parameter. Pages are not cached with query parameters. However, you need to cache the pages so that every time you don't want to make a call to the server because that might hit your performance, right? So that's the reason you need to cache everything. And pages, how to cache it, we use something called as dispatcher in AEM. We don't know dispatcher yet, but we will shortly understand the dispatcher. Okay, pages are not cached with query parameters. However, if we have a selector, we can cache it. It gets cached. Okay, an example here. So how to write it? After the first dot, that is still the content path. It's called as a selector. How will it be? Example. So first from the slash till the first dot is the content path. Do you agree with me? After this HTML over here was an extension. Okay, in this URL here, this .html was. What are the valid extensions? The valid extensions are HTML, JSON, and XML. Okay, so let me add this over here. Here the extension was and in this case after the first dot, if it's any other word, I'll add this dot in bracket. If there is any other word other than a valid extension, it's called a selector. Okay, so example over here, would be something like this. After this content citrix en, let's say I have .pdf, .html. Okay, or let's say all citizens of Canada. Canada. If I want to have another selector, I will say .citizens. .html. Okay. So in the first URL, can somebody tell me what is the selector? Any answers?
PDF.
Exactly. So it will be dot PDF dot. Akash Patel, can you go on mute? There's some disturbance. Thanks. In the second URL, so even you need to include the dot, okay, before this PDF and after the PDF. In the second URL, can somebody tell me what is the selector?
.canada.citizens.
Very good. That's correct. Now, why we need this, we will understand. It's the same thing. Okay, on the server side, when we are processing from the request, you can get the okay. Obviously, it's a servlet. People who are new to servlet, please try to go over some small videos on YouTube about servlets. Request dot get path info dot get selector. This is just a sample snippet. Okay, if on the server side, I would process this like something like this: get selector. If it contains Canada citizens, okay. So you want to target, right? For example, that server side business logic, you could have anything. You'll have one if block for this. If request that get server side contains, you would have some business logic over here. This is why you need a selector, and this is how you process it. For example, for Canada citizens, you want to have a different web page, right? With some offers and discounts. So in this business logic, you can actually form a HTML within a servlet. I don't know how many of you have worked on that. So over here, you will form a different HTML for Canada citizens. Okay, that is one way. The fourth kind of URL is URL. Just give me like a minute. I'll come back in a minute. The fourth kind of URL here is you have something called as a suffix. Okay. So what is the meaning of a suffix? In addition to the selector, if you want to add more, okay, so suffix in addition to the selector, if you want to add more information to the URL, you add a suffix, right? So how do we add a suffix over here? For example, I would say slash all the male users from Canada whose hobbying is hiking. I want to have some extra content, some customization or anything, right? On the server side, how will you process it? If the way you would add it is, you would need to add a slash over here to separate two words, slash and slash, two slashes. Okay. So on the server side, I would say something like this. That get suffix that contains male hiking. Then you want to add some, you will form the HTML within the servlet and pass it back for displaying. Okay. Is this clear with everyone? The four kinds of URL that we can form in AEM. Finally, you could have one URL with everything, with selector, extension, query parameter, and everything. Let me give you an example. Take the same thing. There is selector, there is extension, do you agree that this URL is a combination of everything? It has selector, it has a query parameter, it has a suffix and everything. Right? So let me add that here. Okay, having said that, let's move on to the next. So how does Sling resolution work? Right, when I access some page, what is happening here, right? How it is binding. When I say Sling resolution, right, we need to understand what I'm trying to say over here. You have the model. Okay, this is your data. That is your JCR. Right, some nodes. And then you have your view. Okay, your view is nothing but your JSP or your HTML. Our controller, right, which is our Sling layer here, is trying to bind this data to the view. Okay, this is what it is actually trying to do. The first request, whether it is coming to the model or the view in AEM, can somebody tell me? When I'm accessing a node, I'm actually invoking the data. So this is step number 1. So yeah, this is step number 2. Do everybody agree with what I'm trying to explain logically? Yes or no?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, which means now how this Sling resolution works. Okay, that step we'll understand. Step number 1 is called content resolution. Okay. Now, whenever you enter a path, it will pick up the control will be transferred to the content path. This is step number 1. Step number 2, once you transfer, you will pick up the JCR, will pick up the child node. What is the child node of any page here? Does anybody remember that? That's the reason I added it as a separate note over here, right? The child node of any JCR page, of any CQ colon page, would be a node labeled JCR content. Okay, so the content, the control will be transferred to the child node. You pick up the child node, which is the JCR content. Okay, and on the JCR content, okay, there would be a property called Sling colon resource type. The Sling colon resource type, okay, points to so here a relative path of the view, right? It has to point to the view. This is where the entire binding, this entire diagram binding is happening over here. You need to bind this to view. How? I would have a property called Sling resource type. This will point to the absolute relative path of the view. View means component here, because I know the title is one component, image is one component, right? And every component will have its JSP, or every component. By the way, the JCR primary type of a component is CQ colon component, will have an associated JSP or HTML. Okay. So what I'm trying to say over here is, usually when a developer comes, where does the developer create the components and templates? That would be below your apps folder. You see that there is a geometrics, components, and over here, right, this is the CQ colon component. See this? And this component has its JSP. You look at any component and it would have its JSP. So that's what I'm trying to convey over here. Every component will have its associated JSP. The Sling resource type points to the relative path of the rendering component. Okay. Then once you see example, everything will be clear. Do not worry. Your Sling engine okay. If the component is not found, then it will look in the /libs. Okay, let's apply this logic to a site. Everything will be 100% clear. Now, what is the meaning of relative path and what is absolute path? Any idea in general what is the meaning of relative path and what is absolute path?
Absolute, I think, is the citrix.com, then whatever
Hmm.
path is.
Hmm.
Relative is just from the content, maybe.
Exactly. You're almost there. If it is full path, if it is any day, if you're having something like where it begins over in AEM, for example, let's say apps beginning from root slash apps slash geometrics slash components. Usually the developer, anything that the developer does is below apps, and anything that the author creates, the page rendering components is developed by the developer, the components that will be below apps. However, what I know is the author, whenever any page is created by author, that will be below content, right? So you need to bind slash content to slash apps, right? That's the magic that needs to happen. That's taken care by your Sling resource type property. So content geometrics components, let's say image, I have one component. If I'm beginning with this root node which corresponds to this root node over here, it becomes absolute. The same thing if you have, it will be something like geometrics components page, right? So here I don't need to add this first word over here. The Sling engine will prefix the relative path with slash apps, and then if it is not found, then it will look in the slash lips over here. Okay. Now let's apply this logic to the Sling resolution rule to one of our sites. Give me a minute. Let me show this on a different server. Okay, let's apply our logic, whatever we learned over here. And I go to when I double click on the URL, what is the step number one that should happen? Can anybody explain? Okay, let's look at the document again and we'll try to explain. Control will be transferred to the content path. Okay, now in this case, what is the content path? Can somebody tell me from the URL that you're seeing over here?
Content slash W, hyphen 5. So slash
Il-
EM.
Correct, very good, very good. So content will go over here. Content BMW site. Where is that? It will go over here. Then what is the next step? Pick up the child node, JCR content. Very good. Then it will go and look for the Sling resource type. Okay, it will be something like this. Okay, so it picks up the Sling resource type, which will point to the relative path of the rendering component. So it picks up this path, and then what next? Sling engine will prefix this path with apps. This is a relative path, mind you. So I will add /apps. So this should be a component, right? Means it will have its associated JSP or HTML. So content will come over here. Oh, my BMW is not existing, huh? Okay, so here it's here, right? Apps, BMW, components, page, home page, right? That's what it was pointing to over here. BMW components, page, homepage. So BMW components, page, homepage. You understand, right? Why we are trying to bind from /content to /apps? Because any component that a developer creates will be below /apps. So that's the reason. And it came to this homepage component, and it will display this entire homepage.jsp. So here, if I say JSP file, right, can hold both HTML and Java code. See this? Is this clear with everyone how the resolution works? Any questions? Do you want me to explain again, anybody, or is it clear?
Rajesh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Now, in your CRX,
Uh,
we had this BMW site
uh.
/en, right? So en is not the child of that page. So
Hold on. Where? Here, or here, or where? This one?
under BMW, yeah, content /BMW site /e. Right? So shouldn't we go into the en
No.
page?
Whatever page you double click,
okay.
copy this content path from here. You see this? Any
Okay.
page you open, you copied that path, and you have to go to that path. Oh, I understand. I think I was showing a different thing. That's what you were saying?
Yeah, I was just like, should we go to
Yeah,
the
no. We
site?
should go to that page only. Whichever page we opened, that page only we have to go. If I was on a different one, I did a mistake.
Okay.
Anyway,
And
that
then,
doesn't change here. That's still the same thing. Here
okay,
you wouldn't see the apps. It would be just this. I have hard coded tabs, but you wouldn't see. When you create a site, you'll understand this part.
okay. Yeah, that is fine.
Good. How to create a folder structure? Now we will be delayed. If I show that, it will take another 40 minutes. So I will stop at this point. Okay, you can go through this recording again. Tomorrow, from tomorrow onwards, total hands-on. We are going to create the first site, first template, first component, do a lot of magic with. It's going to be more hands-on. First 3 days only we have theory. From tomorrow onwards, everything is hands-on. Okay, so be ready.
Okay.
Any other questions anybody is having?
Rajesh, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So generally the page is built up with the components, right? So
Hmm.
so when a user tries to access any web page, so the request goes to the page or the components inside it.
Page. It will go to
Okay.
the page. Now it rendered. I only rendered this entire page. Inside this, you are going to build one component one by one,
Okay.
and the request will go to every single component. When I include a component, request will go to that first component. Below this is
Okay.
the second component, request will go to that second component. So that way, we are going to include it within the page. That's
Okay.
that's the future sessions.
And it's not going to show up in the URL, right? The in each individual component.
No, no, no. Only it
Okay.
will show the page because it will be included inside the page. So that's why it will not show up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Any other question is having anybody? Very good. Looks like all the peoples are clear. Okay. So let me stop over here today. Tomorrow when you come back, we will be creating the site and have all your AEM instances up and running. We are going to do the exercises tomorrow onwards. Okay. Thanks guys. Thanks for your time then. Today we'll meet
Thanks.
tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.